Idaho Territory, November 1889. The mountains have already swallowed the road south. Pull back further. The whole Sawtooth Valley, white and absolute nothing moving in any direction for 14 miles. Then one camp, Crest Yellow timber, smoke from a dozen chimneys, thick and desperate, the kind of work that means people burning more than they planned. Move closer. A mess hall, a long table, a torn piece of paper, two halves fluttering in cold air from an open door. Closer still, a young woman's hands, steady, not shaking, picking up a wool blanket, a dull knife, half a loaf of bread. That is all. 2 years of work, and that is everything she is permitted to carry. She turns toward the door. Behind her, a man watches. He never looks at her eyes. Outside, the temperature is dropping, and somewhere up on that mountain, behind a waterfall, no one from this camp has ever thought to look behind. Something is waiting. The 9th day of the blizzard. That is where we begin, not at the beginning, not with the accusation or the torn contract, or the moment she walked out of Crest Hollow with nothing but a blanket and half a loaf of barley bread. We begin here, 9 days in. Temperature sitting at 22 below zero outside. Wind hammering the mountain like it has a personal grudge. And behind a waterfall locked in ice, a waterfall that nobody in Crest Hollow even knows has a cave behind it, a 21-year-old girl is sitting beside a fire. Calm. Câu thoại hook mạnh nhất để đưa vào tiêu đề hoặc thumbnail. I hope you stay. Câu này ngắn bí ẩn không giải thích được ngữ cảnh nếu chỉ đọc tiêu đề đúng công thức Curiosity gấp. Người xem không biết ai nói với ai, tại sao, từ khi nào và phải bấm vào để hiểu. Tiêu đề mạnh nhất tổng hợp sợ hãi và sợ xấu vì kết hợp được câu thoại hook trực tiếp với hành động bí ẩn, đúng chuẩn, VET-IQ, keyword, rõ cảm xúc mạnh, curiosity, gặp cao độ dài tối ưu. She checks her remaining wood, places one more heated stone beneath the hides near her bed, looks at the 9th mark on the wall. The storm is not finished. Neither is she. Now, rewind 3 weeks back to before any of this, to when Solveig Lund was still just the girl who kept the books. Sawtooth Valley, Idaho Territory, November 1889. The kind of cold that arrives before the calendar says it should. The kind that finds the gaps in the chinking and slides through like it owns the place. The mountains to the north already white. The logging road already treacherous by mid-morning. And deep inside Crest Hollow Timber Camp, which is what Mordecai Ketch called his operation, though the men who worked it had other names. A young woman was counting flour, 17 pounds, down from 23. She made the mark in her ledger. Small, precise the numbers, sitting straight, even though the table she wrote on had a wobble in the left leg that nobody had fixed in 3 years. That was Solveig. She noticed things like that. The wobble, the gap in the chinking above the east bunk, the way the storehouse door never quite latched on the first try. The way Rafe Ketch, the owner's son, had a habit of appearing near that same storehouse door after midnight on nights when ore wagons were expected. She noticed. She didn't say anything, because in Crest Hollow, the word of an indentured girl weighed about as much as the flower she was counting. Solveig had been at Crestalo for 2 years. Her parents died of typhoid fever on a supply wagon 12 miles outside of Boise. She was 19, no relatives in Idaho Territory, no money, no options that didn't involve walking back the way she came and hoping for something better in the opposite direction. Mordecai Ketch offered her something better, in writing even, a labor contract, 4 years, food, shelter, medical care if needed, in exchange cooking, ledger keeping, supply management. She could read, which not everyone could. She could calculate, which was rarer still. Her father had been a timber worker in Norway before the crossing. He understood moisture content and grain and the way wood behaves differently in wet, cold versus dry. He'd taught her that numbers told the truth even when people didn't. Her mother had been a midwife and an herbalist. She kept meticulous records of every plant she used, every patient she saw, every treatment that worked, and the ones that didn't. She taught Solveig that knowledge was the one thing you could carry across an ocean, and nobody could take it off you at the border. Both of them gone, 12 miles outside of Boise. And here was Mordecai Ketch offering a contract. She signed it. Because 19 and alone in Idaho Territory in 1889 left you with exactly that many options. Mordecai Ketch was not a violent man. This was the thing people misunderstood about him. He never raised his voice, never raised his hand. The men who worked his timber operation were never struck, never overtly threatened, never handed anything they could point to and call abuse. What Mordecai Ketch did was keep very careful ledgers. Death in his camp was a living thing. It grew in the dark. A man arrived needing winter gear added to his account. He broke a tool added. He got sick and needed 2 days off work added because the work still had to be done and someone else had to do it, and that cost money. By the time spring came, many of the men found themselves owing more than they'd earned. And what could you do about that really? Leave and go where, and how would you survive the road out? You owed for your boots after all. Solveig understood what Mordecai was doing. She understood it the way you understand a machine, from watching its moving parts, tracing the logic of each gear. She never had illusions about him. She simply worked. She kept the books. She weighed the flour. She counted the lamp oil. She made her marks. And in a smaller ledger, the one her mother had used for herb records, still faintly smelling of dried sage, she kept marks of her own. Not accounts, observation. Small symbols, the kind her mother used for plant repurposed. A circle meant a door opened after hours. A dash meant footsteps heard, direction noted. A triangle meant something in the storehouse had moved between evening count and morning count. She wasn't planning to accuse anyone. She just wanted to know what was true. Numbers didn't lie, even the ones nobody else was keeping. Rafe Ketch was 24 years old and had never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He had his father's eyes watchful, calculating, and his mother's charm, though his mother had died when he was 7, and the charm had curdled over the years into something that looked like confidence from a distance. Up close, it was something else. The way he smiled a half second after everyone else. The way he always stood so his back was near a wall. He gambled. This was not a secret at Crest Hollow. The men knew. Mordecai knew in the way that a man knows something he has chosen not to make his problem. Card games with the teamsters who came through. Horses sometimes, though horses in November were a different kind of gamble. Money went out of Rafe's pocket and generally didn't come back. What nobody knew was how much. Solvay's ledger had some guesses. The payroll box arrived on a Thursday. Ezra, Falk foreman for the Silver Run mining operation 40 miles north, was passing through with a crew on his way to winter quarters. He had 32 men's wages in a walnut box with a brass lock and an iron handle. It was about 18 inches long and heavy enough to make a man adjust his grip. He handed it to Mordecai Ketch for overnight safekeeping. Standard practice. Crestallo was the only operation in the valley with a proper lockable office. That evening, Rafe Ketch lost 2 months of future wages in a card game he'd had no business starting. The men he lost to were teamsters. They wanted payment before sunrise, and they had the particular patience of men who had traveled a long way in the cold and were not interested in waiting. What happened next, Solveig did not see. But she pieced it together later the way her mother had pieced together a patient's illness from symptoms working backwards from what she knew. Rafe took the spare office key from his father's desk. He unlocked the office sometime after midnight. He carried the payroll box to the old weighing shed on the north end of camp, pried up a floorboard, tucked the box underneath, took enough silver coin to silence the teamsters. Not all of it, just enough. Just what he needed for tonight. And then, and this was the part that mattered, the part that made everything else possible, he reached into the box first, took out one piece of Silver Run script, walked across camp in the dark, and slipped it into Solveig Lund's sewing pouch through the gap under her bunk room door. One small piece of paper, enough to explain where the box had gone, enough to point in a direction that wasn't his. Morning came the way November mornings did at that elevation. Grey, heavy, the smell of snow on the air before the snow itself arrived. By breakfast, the payroll box was gone. Ezra Falk discovered it at 6:15. He stood in the office doorway for a moment looking at the space where the box had been, the way people stand when the world has just done something they haven't fully processed yet. Then he went to find Mordecai Ketch. The search took less than an hour. Mordecai's men checked the storehouse first, then the bunkhouses, then someone Solveig never knew who checked her small room. The script was in her sewing pouch, tucked under a spool of brown thread. She hadn't put it there. She didn't own Silver Run script. She had never been to Silver Run and had no reason to handle their payroll. None of that was the point. The point was that it was in her sewing pouch. The trial, if you could call it that, was held in the mess hall at noon. Mordecai sat at the head table. Ezra Falk sat beside him. Workers filed in, some still pulling on their coats, some who hadn't eaten yet and stood near the back looking confused. Men from the timber crew, 2 of the teamsters who were still in camp, and there was Rafe Ketch, standing just behind his father's left shoulder, one hand in his coat pocket. He had been to that coat pocket several times this morning, Solveig noted. She had watched him without appearing to watch him. The way her mother used to observe a patient who was trying to hide how much pain they were in. Mordecai laid the evidence on the table. The script, the testimony of two men who said they had seen Solveig near the office building the previous evening, which was technically true since her room was 40 feet from the office building and she walked past it every day. Solveig stood in the center of the room. "If I had the key," she said, "why would I steal one piece of script and leave it in my own sewing kit?" The room was very quiet. Mordecai looked at the table. "Why is there no damage to the lock?" she asked. Her voice was steady, her mother's voice calm and precise when someone's life depended on being understood. "The lock is intact. Whoever took that box used a key. Has anyone accounted for the spare?" Mordecai shuffled the paper in front of him. "The footprint outside the office," she said. "Has anyone looked at them?" Nobody answered, because nobody had. Behind his father, Rafe Ketch kept his hand in his coat pocket, right over the place where his palm had pressed against a rough floorboard that morning, where the wood had left marks that looked, if you knew what to look for, exactly like what they were. Solveig looked at him. He looked at the wall beside her left ear. He would not look at her eyes. Not once in the whole proceeding would Rafe Ketch look directly at Solveig Lund's eyes. She noted that too. Mordecai tore her labor contract in half. He set the two pieces on the table. Then he set the debt ledger beside them. The message required no explanation. The contract was void, but the debt it had generated was not. She no longer belonged at Crest Hollow, but she still somehow owed Crest Hollow. By sunset, she had to leave. She was permitted to keep one wool blanket, one tin cup, the kitchen knife with the dull blade that she'd been meaning to sharpen, half a loaf of barley bread, somewhat stale, the clothes she stood in, her mother's herb ledger, which was in her coat pocket and which nobody thought to search for because it was small, and nobody at Crest Hollow had ever had much interest in what Solveig Lund was reading. That was everything. Rowena Briggs moved first. She was the camp's laundress, a widow who had been at Crest Hollow longer than almost anyone else, and she came forward through the crowd with the coat that had belonged to her husband, heavy canvas lined with wool, the kind of coat that didn't look like much but would keep a person alive. Mordecai stopped her. "Anyone who assists this woman," he said quiet, "and even loses half their winter ration." Rowena stood very still. She was looking at Solveig, and Solveig was looking back at her, and something passed between them, the kind of thing that passes between women who have both been told at different moments by different men in different words that what they have to offer doesn't matter. Rowena lowered her arms. She held onto the coat. She did not put it back. She just stood there holding it while Solveig turned toward the door. In the back of the mess hall, Wendell Foss, the school teacher hired 6 weeks ago to educate the workers' children through winter, stood very quietly. He was watching Rafe Ketch. Rafe had still not moved his hand from his coat pocket, had still not looked toward the spot where Ezra Falk's payroll box had been stored, had still not looked at Solveig Lund's eyes. Wendell filed these things away. He was a man who had trained himself to observe, because you couldn't teach children anything unless you first understood what they weren't saying. He watched. He did not speak, not yet. The pieces of Solveig's labor contract blew across the yard when someone opened the mess hall door. She didn't look back. The logging road south ran 14 miles to the nearest settlement. 14 miles of corduroy road over mountain terrain in November, with a temperature already dropping as the sun went down and clouds building to the northwest, with the specific dark weight of serious precipitation on its way. She made it 3 miles. The rain started first, cold and sideways, the kind that finds every gap between scarf and collar and makes itself at home. The road turned slick. Then the rain thickened into something not quite snow and not quite rain, and worse than either, sleet, hitting her face like small cold accusations. At a fork in the road, a fallen pine blocked the lower route completely. Solveig looked at the upper slope. No trail, just rock and scrub pine and the sound of wind coming down through the gaps with a purpose she didn't care to argue with. She climbed. Her father's voice somewhere in the back of her skull: conserve heat before you need to. Move steadily. Don't run. Running burns through everything fast and leaves you nothing. She moved steadily. She didn't run. The cold got specific. That was how it happened. Slowly, then specifically. First, her hands a tingling in the fingertips that became a throb, that became past a certain point an absence. Then her feet, not painful, which was worse than painful. The absence of pain was the warning her body could barely still manage. She drank from droplets on the rocks instead of kneeling at any stream, because kneeling cost time and getting wet cost warmth, and she was calculating the whole way up that slope what she had against what she needed, how far she might go against how much she had left. The half loaf of bread stayed tucked under her dress against her skin where it would stay dry. The knife stayed at her belt. The blanket stayed over her shoulders. Her mother's ledger stayed in her coat pocket next to her heart, which was the only warm thing left. And then she heard it. Water, deep, steady, ongoing. The sound of something falling a long way and landing with commitment. Not a stream, not a trickle, something more serious than that. She turned toward it, not because she felt hope, because it was the only direction left that wasn't down, and down led back to a road she couldn't walk. And she had done enough calculating tonight to know that stopping was not an option she could afford. Hollow Mist Falls. She almost didn't see it at first. The trees ended, and there it was, 47 feet of water dropping from a black basalt ledge into a stone basin, and the rain had swelled it into something that filled the whole gap with noise and cold mist. Ice had begun to form along the edges where the spray hit rock. The whole face of the cliff glittered, and she stood at the edge of the spray zone and thought, this is the end of the path. Except she squinted through the mist. The water didn't cling flat against the cliff. Not entirely. On the right side, close to the stone not in the main fall, there was a darkness that was different from the darkness of wet rock. A gap. Air behind water. She used a pine branch to test each step. Moss on rock, ice beginning to form on the wet surfaces. She slipped. One caught herself on an outcropping that tore her palm. Slipped again harder, her knee hitting stone, and nearly lost the knife from her belt. But she reached the gap, and what she found behind the waterfall was a crack in the rock face, 3 feet 8 inches high, 26 inches wide. She knew these measurements because she had to measure herself against them to understand whether she could fit. She could fit, barely. Cold air drifted from inside, carrying, and she stood there for one moment, just breathing it in, the smell of dry earth, old ash, and something else faint and specific, weathered leather. She dropped to her knees, shoved the wet blanket ahead of her, turned sideways, and twisted herself into the dark. The passage went up 30 feet, maybe more, and after the first few yards, the stone became dry. The roar of hollow mist fell behind her and transformed into a vibration she felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears. She stopped, reached one hand back toward the entrance. The storm was still there. She could feel its edges. For the first time since Crash Tallow, she could not feel it on her skin. The chamber was 24 feet long, 16 wide. The ceiling peaked at 11 feet in the center. Almost no light. She felt her way along the wall. Toned stone, a change in texture, and then a ring of blackened rock, a hearth, old but used. Beside the hearth, tucked into a crevice at a height that made sense above dampness, below awkwardness, a dented tin box. She opened it with hands that barely worked. Inside, a few strands of dry bark, a small piece of flint. She tried 4 times before the spark caught. Rotten wood from beneath a raised stone shelf caught slowly, then held. And in that first weak light she saw what time had left behind. Stake holes in the floor, old ones deep, the wood long rotted out. Elevated storage shelves, a shallow depression below the main level. Drainage, she realized, or cold storage. Rotting basket fragments that had held their ship through the dry air. 5 rolled hides, though 3 were thick with mold and would need work she didn't have tools for yet. Small jars and crocks, most cracked or empty. And on the highest shelf, the one that had stayed driest, a deer hide marked with symbol. Water she recognized, and wind directions, and slope markings of the kind her father had taught her to read on a Norwegian mountain when she was 7. A map of something in a language she didn't fully speak yet. But she kept looking. Bone needles, thin sheets of mica, a rusted knife worth saving, a small alcohol thermometer wrapped in oilcloth, the case carved with a date, 1879, and tucked inside the oilcloth wrapping against the thermometer a small journal. The cover was water-stained at one corner but intact. She opened it. The handwriting was careful, English, but with the particular precision of someone who had learned it as a second language and used it with more deliberateness than a native speaker would. At the top of the first page, 2 initials, P.V., and a date, winter 1879. She didn't read it then. She was too cold, too close to the line. She had to take care of the fire first, and then her hand, and then her feet, and then figure out what she actually had in this chamber in terms of what could keep her alive, because she was still calculating. She was always still calculating. She found 3 jars, still sealed. One held dried camas root and pine nuts. The top layer smelled old, but when she broke through, the interior was dry. One held hard service berry cakes untouched. One, sealed with beeswax, held willow bark and yarrow and sage. There was a packet of pemmican that had gone bad around the edges. She cut the compromise section away, tasted a small piece of the center, and waited. Her stomach accepted it. She cut herself one more small piece and stopped there. Then she took the piece of charcoal from near the hearth and found a flat section of the stone wall. She drew a line. Beside it, the current temperature reading from the thermometer, 34 degrees Fahrenheit near the entrance, 42 degrees Fahrenheit at the center of the chamber. Her stores, her fuel, the condition of each item on the shelves. She recorded everything. The same columns her mother kept for patience. The same columns she'd kept for Mordecai Ketch, except that these columns belonged to her. Every mark on this wall was hers. Every number reflected her survival, no one else's profit. Before she let herself sleep, she did one more thing. She opened P.V.'s journal to the second page. The first entry was dated November 14th, 1879. The handwriting was steady. Found the passage by accident. Running from worse trouble than I knew how to name. The Shoshone were here before me. You can see it in the stake holes, the drainage, the way the storage is built for long term rather than overnight. Someone understood this place. I am trying to learn what they knew. She read the next 2 entries. Then she stopped. She placed the journal back on the shelf. In the morning, she would read more. She would learn who PV was and what worse trouble meant and why this person had come here 10 years ago and apparently left. But right now, what she knew was enough. Someone had been here before her. Someone who had found this place the same way she had, running from something they couldn't name, arriving without planning, discovering by accident that the mountain had made room. They had survived. They had left what they learned, and she was going to use every piece of it. She placed a heated stone pulled from near the fire using the raw hide, careful not to let the hide burn, beneath the sleeping hides near the back wall. She set the tinder box on the highest shelf, above the water line, above the reach of dampness. She made one more mark on the wall. Day 1. Then she lay down in the dark, inside a mountain that had been keeping its secrets for decades, while the storm outside hammered at the valley below, and Crest Hollow Timber Camp burned through its carefully rationed firewood. And for the first time in 2 years, the numbers she wrote on a wall were her own. She slept. Outside, the snow came in earnest now. It buried the logging road and the fences and the low roofs of Crest Hollow's outbuildings. It found the gaps in cabin walls and sipped in as cold air and ice crystals. Inside the mess hall, Mordecai Ketch sat at the long table after everyone else had gone to bed. The 2 pieces of Solveig Lund's labor contract lay in front of him. Beside them, The debt ledger, the numbers she had been so careful about, still precise and neat in her small, careful hand. He looked at the numbers for a while. Then he picked up his pen and began to transfer her outstanding balance into the camp's general account. Losses from theft. That was what he would call it. He was very precise about these things. Across the camp, in the bunkhouse nearest the north fence, Rafe Ketch lay awake on his bunk, looking at the ceiling. His hand had been in that coat pocket so many times today that the inside seam was starting to wear. He thought about the footprints, the ones Solveig had mentioned, the ones nobody had looked at. He decided after a while that the snow would cover them by morning. He was right about that. He went to sleep. Rowena Briggs did not go to sleep. She sat in her small room beside the washing vats, holding the canvas coat she had not been permitted to give away, and she thought about the look in Solveig Lund's eyes when she had been told she had to leave. Not frightened, not even angry exactly, just careful. The way a person looks when they are taking very precise stock of their situation. Rowena had a lot of practice reading that look. She had worn it herself 7 years ago when she arrived at Crest Hollow with nothing after her husband's death, and Mordecai Ketch had offered her a contract. She brushed the snow off the coat's shoulders. She hung it beside her bed. She didn't know why. There was no one to give it to now. The girl was gone, but it seemed wrong to put it away. In the schoolroom, a single repurposed storeroom with a wood stove and 12 child-sized chairs, Wendell Foss sat at his small desk with a piece of paper and a pen. He was not writing a lesson plan. He was writing down everything he had observed in the mess hall that afternoon. Rafe Ketch's hand in his coat pocket. The direction of his gaze, which had avoided 2 points consistently, Solveig Lund's face and the spot near the office where the payroll box had been held. The lock, which Solveig had pointed out, was undamaged. The spare key, which no one had accounted for. He wrote it all down, in the order it had happened, with the times as best he could reconstruct them. He had been hired to teach reading and arithmetic, but his father had been a county clerk for 30 years, and he had grown up watching a man take careful notes about everything because careful notes were the only thing that survived when memory got contested. He folded the paper, put it in the inside pocket of his coat, and thought about what he was going to do with it. Outside Crest Hollow's perimeter fence, the snow was 6 inches deep and falling. The logging road south the road Solveig Lund had started down 3 hours ago was already impassable, which meant nobody was going anywhere, which meant for now everything was exactly where Mordecai Ketch intended it to be. Up on the mountain, behind the waterfall, the fire in the old hearth burned low and steady. The thermometer on the shelf read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The girl inside was asleep, her breath coming even and slow, the heated stone beneath the hides keeping the immediate space several degrees warmer than the chamber around her. On the wall, one charcoal mark. One day, the first of 9. Day 2. She woke up before the fire died. That was the first thing she learned about herself in this place. Her body had recalibrated overnight. Some part of her brain, the part her mother always called the watching part, the part that stays awake even when the rest of you, doesn't had set itself to the fire the way a clock sets itself to the sun. She felt the temperature drop 2 degrees and opened her eyes. The chamber was dark except for the embers. She fed them carefully. Small pieces first, dry bark, then a stick no wider than her thumb, then something larger, but only when the smaller thing had fully caught. Her father's voice again: "A fire is a conversation, not a command. You don't order it. You offer it things and wait to see what it accepts." She waited, it accepted. By the time grey light crept through the passage from the waterfall entrance, the chamber was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and she had already begun her second day's inventory, because inventory was thinking, and thinking was surviving, and she had a very great deal to figure out. The food first, the kamas and pine nut, roughly 12 days if she was careful. The service berry cakes, another 4, maybe 5. The willow bark and yarrow, not food but medicine, which was its own kind of survival currency. The pemmican salvageable center portion 3 days, total somewhere between 15 and 18 days of food, if she was careful, which she would be, because careful was the only mode she had ever operated in, and she saw no reason to stop now. The fuel was harder to calculate. The wood stored in the chamber was old and partly rotted. It would burn fast and hot and not last. She needed fresh wood from outside, which meant climbing down the slope below the falls each morning, which cost time and energy, which meant she needed to eat enough to do it, which brought her back to the food calculation, a closed loop. She sat beside the hearth and drew the loop on the wall in charcoal, not because drawing it helped solve it, because seeing it written made it a problem with a shape instead of a feeling with no edges. Problems with shapes could be worked on. Feelings with no edges just ate you. She lit the fire on day 2 and the muck tried to kill her. Not immediately, not dramatically. The smoke dropped instead of rising, rolled sideways, spread across the stone floor, thickened the air in the back of the chamber where her sleeping space was. She coughed, eyes streaming, smothered the fire with damp soil from the floor's drainage trench, crawled toward the passage entrance for air, sat in the cold of the gap for a long moment breathing, and then did not feel sorry for herself, because feeling sorry took energy, and energy was on the list of things she was carefully rationing. She pulled a loose strand of wool from the edge of her blanket, held it at different points in the chamber, watched which way it moved. Near the center ceiling, nothing. Near the back wall, nothing. Near a stone shelf on the left wall, barely. A faint drift upward. She looked at the deer hide map. She'd studied it again last night, slowly trying to learn its language. The symbols her mother used for plants, the symbols her father used for terrain. Some of these looked like both layered older marks beneath newer ones, different hands across different years, a document of accumulated knowledge rather than a single person's record. There was a winding mark near a rectangle that might mean room or chamber, and from it a line going up and to the left, ending at a mark she now recognized as meaning gap, opening, somewhere the air could move. She followed the left wall with her hand, found the back edge of the second storage shelf, found beyond it a narrow upward passage she had missed in the dark. Cool air drifting down it, bringing with it the smell of pine and ice, and outside, a vent clogged mostly roots, accumulated pine needles, the compacted debris of years. She spent 2 hours clearing what she could reach with the salvaged sapling pole and the stone awl. Twice she nearly lost her footing on the wet stone. Once something fell on her head that she chose not to identify. But when she came back to the hearth and lit a small test fire, a strand of wool held near the ceiling above the firebox, trembling, rising, she leaned back on her heels and watched the smoke follow it up. Clean, straight, gone. She sat with that for a moment, just that, the smoke rising exactly the way it was supposed to, and something in her chest released that she hadn't known she was holding. Now the real work began. She had shelter fire water from the spring she'd found on day 3, a crack in the rock where water flowed year round, cold enough to hurt her teeth but unfrozen, which was the only thing that mattered. Now the work was turning this damaged cache into something that could actually function. She built small. That was the first principle she derived from her father's timber knowledge and her mother's patient efficiency. Don't heat what you can't afford to lose. She wasn't heating the whole chamber. She was building a smaller world inside it. Willow branches, bent and lashed with rawhide, formed a low frame at the highest and driest corner of the floor. The 2 undamaged hides became walls. The third hide trimmed to remove the mold, a job she did carefully and without complaint, because complaining did not remove a mold, became an outer layer near the entrance. 2 layers of hide, air between them. Because her father had once explained at a worksite in the Sawtooth foothills, where she was maybe 11 years old and mostly just trying to stay out of the way, that still air was the best insulator on earth. Better than wool, better than fur. You didn't need to make warmth, he said. You needed to trap the warmth you already had. She built a small world that trapped warmth. Then she tested it. Day 4 was 9 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Inside the sleeping enclosure, 49 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 small bundle of wood. Smoke clean, hides dry. She wrote it on the wall. Day 5 was 7 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Inside the sleeping enclosure, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Same bundle. She was getting more efficient, learning how the fire breathed, learning when to add fuel and when to leave it alone. The conversation her father talked about, she was getting better at it. In Crest Hollow, things were also developing. Ezra Falk was stuck. The snow that had fallen on the night Solveig was expelled had continued for 3 more days, and the passes north were closed, and a man with 32 workers' wages missing from his custody had nothing to do but sit in the camp he was sheltering in and think about numbers. He was a foreman. Numbers were his profession. He went over the account of what was missing. He went over the timeline of when the box was last confirmed present, and when it was discovered, gone. He went over the amount that had been taken from the box, which he knew precisely because he had counted it himself twice before handing it to Mordecai Ketch for safekeeping. And then he looked at the debt ledger, the one that now showed a theft attributed to one Solveig Lund. The numbers in the theft amount did not match the numbers in the missing payroll. They were close, but not the same, which meant either the theft accusation was accounting for some but not all of the missing amount, or the theft accusation was wrong. He sat with that for a long time. Then he went to find Wendell Foss because the schoolteacher was the only person in this camp who had spoken to him in the last 4 days like a man who was trying to understand something rather than a man who had already decided. Rowena Briggs kept the coat beside her bed. Each morning she shook it out, checked the lining, did small maintenance that served no purpose anyone else could identify. She was not going to talk about why. She just did it. On the 6th day, Prentice Wall came back from the northern trap lines. He was 58 years old, lean in the way that men get who have spent decades working hard country, with hands that looked like they had been left out in several consecutive winters, and eyes that had learned not to share what they were thinking until they had finished thinking it. He had worked out of Crest Hollow for 11 years. Before that, he had operated independent trap lines in the eastern Sawtooth Range until those lines had been absorbed. Legally, he had been told through a transfer of land right he had never fully understood into Mordecai Ketch's holdings. He had never contested it because he hadn't had evidence, just his own certainty and the particular specific memory of what had been his versus what the paperwork said. Certainty without evidence was just noise in a camp like Crestalo. So he had stayed, he had worked, he had said nothing. He came back from the northern lines on the 6th day, stomped the snow from his boots in the doorway of the camp's main hall, and was immediately told about the girl who had been expelled. He listened. He asked 2 questions. First, what was her name? Second, which direction did she go? He was told Solveig Lund, presumably south toward the settlement, though of course given the conditions, he nodded. Went to his bunk, slept for 6 hours because he'd been out for 11 days and his body required it regardless of what his mind was doing. Then he got up before dawn and went out again. He went north and east along a ridge line he had walked so many times it was less like remembering the route and more like his feet simply knowing. And when he reached a certain shelf of rock above the eastern valley wall, he stopped, looked. A thin thread of smoke, right up from the cliffside above Hollow Mist Falls, from a place where no smoke had any geological business rising. Clean smoke, straight, controlled fire. He stood there for a long time. He did not go directly to the fall. He went back to camp first, made himself breakfast, ate it slowly, had a cup of bitter coffee, and spoke to no one about what he had seen. Then he gathered 3 things from his supply stores: a small cloth bag of salt, 2 lengths of wire the kind used for snares, a scrap of heavy canvas that was left over from a pack repair job. He wrapped these in a piece of oilcloth. Then he took the eastern approach, not the creek bed route, where ice would make every step a negotiation with gravity, but the long way around, along the ridge where wind had swept the snow to a manageable depth. He was a man who knew how to move through difficult terrain without spending more than he had. An hour and a half later, he was 20 yards from the lower passage entrance below Hollow Mist. He set the bundle in the snow, stepped back, turned, began to walk away. Because he had left things before for people who needed them, and the ones who were worth leaving things for always came out on their own time. Solveig had watched him from the narrow ledge above the falls. She had heard the approach 20 minutes before he appeared, footsteps that were deliberate, not searching. No voices, no metal striking stone. One person, not in a hurry, not trying to hide. She had the restored trapper's knife in her hand, not raised, just present. She watched him set the bundle down, watched him step back, watched him turn and begin to walk. And she stepped out from behind the ice-edged rock. He stopped without turning, because of course he heard her. A man who had spent 40 years in high country terrain did not miss a footstep on frozen rock. He turned around slowly and looked at her, not the way the men in the mess hall had looked at her, not the way Mordecai Ketch had looked at her, weighing, calculating, finding her value in columns. He looked at her the way her father used to look at a piece of timber he was trying to understand, seeing what was actually there. His eyes moved, taking in the smoke rising clean and straight behind her, the way she was standing upright, not hunched, the fact that she was holding the knife at her side, not defensively, just at hand, the faint scent of camas on the cold air. He said nothing for a moment. Clean smoke, he finally said. I found the vent on day 2. A pause. Then the drainage trench. Day 3. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The map helped, she said. That made him still. Genuinely still in a way he hadn't been before. He looked at her, then at the passage entrance, then back at her. Baby, she said. He breathed out slowly through his nose, a long breath. Prenticeful, she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. And in a man who had that face in this cold, that was the same thing. The journal, she said. I didn't read all of it yet. You'll want to. She waited. There's more in there than just the shelter notes, he said. There's a reason I was up here. In 79. He paused. And it's the same reason you're up here now. She looked at him. Aldous Ketch, she said, because she'd read the first several entries, because she was good at reading between the lines of careful language written by someone trying not to say something directly, because Mordecai had a brother named Aldous who had died 8 years ago, and some of the trapline records she'd processed in the ledger had a gap in them that she'd always found curious. Mordecai, he said quietly. Aldous was the one who did the paperwork. Mordecai ran the camp, but the land transfer, the trap lines, that was both of them. She thought about the timeline. 1879, the journal, the shelter notes that got more detailed as the entries progressed, less about escape and more about understanding. You came back, she said. Couldn't prove anything. He said it flatly, without bitterness, just as fact. So I stayed, kept my head down, learned the mountains they took from me as sketch terrain so I could walk them anyway. A pause. Worked until now? She understood what he meant. He was telling her something, not asking her to act on it, just telling her. Because she was the one who kept the books, and the books had a gap in them. The beeswax jar, she said. Third shelf, yarrow and willow bark. I put that there in 81, left it for. He stopped. Didn't know who. Anyone who might need it. She nodded. He looked at the falls for a moment, the ice that had built up along the edges overnight, the water coming through the center, still dark and determined. There's a storm coming, he said. Real one, not this. He gestured at the general persistent cold around them. Pressure's been dropping since Tuesday. Birds are ground level. Wind shifted northeast this morning. She filed all of that. How long? 3 days, maybe 4 before it hits. After that, he looked at the sky, which was doing something she couldn't read yet, but he clearly could. A week, maybe more. She thought about her stores, her fuel calculations, the enclosure she'd built. I'll need to prepare, she said. Yes. A pause. Rafe is asking questions, he said. About the smoke. I don't know what he'll do. He'll come up, she said. Probably. I'll be ready for that. He looked at her for one more moment, taking in what was actually there. The person who built this place, he said quietly, would recognize what you're doing. He turned and walked back into the show. You know that feeling, the one where you've gone too far to turn back, but you're not sure yet, not completely sure whether you were right to start. Every extra bundle of firewood she hauled up the slope, every new lash on the sleeping enclosure frame, every calculation she made about what she had versus what she needed. She wasn't certain, she was just moving, because her father taught her that the mountain didn't care about your certainty. It only cared about your decisions. She made them one at a time. Rafe came on day 7. She heard them an hour before they arrived. 3 sets of footsteps, metal against rock a pry bar by the sound of it. The echo patterns of people who were moving through terrain they didn't know. She had already begun moving. The thermometer, her mother's ledger, the deer hide map, the knife, the tinder box, the remaining food stores, most of her bedding. She carried these down into the lower passage, the one she'd found on day 5, the double line on the map that led southeast through the mountain's lower system to an exit among willow scrub and talus a half-mile from the falls. She'd explored it once. She knew its dimensions. She knew where the ceiling dropped and where the floor was uneven. Then she turned back to the main chamber. Using loose stone and a forked branch she'd brought up for exactly this purpose, she narrowed the tunnel entrance. Not blocked. A small gap remained near the floor because the passage needed air and because a complete blockage looked intentional. A partial collapse looked like time and geology doing what time and geology did. She stepped back, looked at her work, then took herself and her lamp down into the lower system and waited. Rafe Ketch was not good at terrain. He was good at cards, good at calculations of a certain kind, the kind where you knew who held which debt and how much pressure it would take to move them. He was less good at physical problems, less good at ice-covered rock faces and the particular algebra of footing on a slope. He slipped twice before they reached the falls. One of the men with him, she could hear them clearly through the stone, trapped his foot between two boulders and stopped entirely unwilling to continue. Rafe kept going, found the gap behind the waterfall, found the narrowed entrance, looked through it into a chamber that held nothing recognizable as habitation. Stone, old ash near the center, cold air coming from somewhere. "There's nothing here," said the remaining man. "There's another entrance somewhere." Rafe's voice flat and certain. "Rafe." A pause. "Look at the sky." She could feel the barometric pressure changing even from inside the passage. A long silence from the other side of the stone. Then Rafe's voice directed at the darkness, calm and specific. "Nobody from Crest Hollow is coming to look for you once the storm hits." She sat in the dark of the lower passage and listened. "Winter will finish what I started." He believed it. That was the thing she understood about Rafe Ketch, sitting 12 feet away from him through a wall of stone she had built with her own hands. He believed the mountain was on his side. That cold was a weapon that worked for the people who had roofs. That weather was a form of justice that favored the house. He had never been wrong about that before, because he had never been on the wrong side of it before. He turned and left. She listened to the footsteps fade. Then she sat in the dark for a while longer, not because she was afraid, because she was thinking, and thinking in the dark, in the cold, with the walls of the mountain around her. That was what she had instead of company. The coyote came on day 8. She smelled it before she heard it. That particular animal musk, sharper in cold air, coming from the direction of the lower entrance where she'd been hanging the rabbit pelts to dry. She had been setting snares since day 4. The map's track marks had led her to a stand of willow below the eastern ridge, where snowshoe hair trails crossed in a pattern that told her this was regular transit, not accident. First 2 days nothing. One snare dragged sideways. The bait gone. Loop never closed. She moved them, made the placement narrower, the loop lower, matched the geometry of the trail. Day 6 first hair. She had cleaned it completely. Meat, hide, sinew, bone, even the small fat deposit. Everything had a use. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. She had been thinking about that. The difference between the camp below, where things got used until they broke and then either fixed or discarded, and this place where there was no discarding, where the question was never "is this worth something?" but rather "what does this become next?" Crest Hollow kept ledgers of what things cost. She was learning to keep ledgers of what things could do. Different math. Better math, maybe. The coyote came to the lower entrance because she had rabbit. She was carrying a heated stone back from the fire when she heard the sound low, the sound of an animal that is hungry enough that the sound escapes before they mean it to. She set the stone down without hurrying, picked up the pole she kept beside the fire. It was at the mouth of the lower passage. Head down, eyes reflecting the small light of her lamp. Young, lean in the way that meant days without eating. She was not a person who had been afraid of animals. Her mother had treated enough animals alongside people that she'd learned the common language of pain and hunger and wanting. This animal was hungry. It was not wrong for being hungry. She was also not going to let it have her food. She raised the pole, moved forward steadily, held the lamp up so the light was in its eyes, made herself larger. The coyote backed up. She kept moving forward. It turned and went. She stood at the entrance for a moment, breathing, watching the place where it had been. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her, not because she was particularly brave, but because she was realizing, standing in the entrance of a mountain passage she'd built her survival inside in the dark at 8 days and counting, that something had shifted in the territory of what she was afraid of. The things that had seemed threatening back in Crest Hollow, the ledger, the contract, the room full of people who had decided, those were still real. They still had weight, but they were down in the valley somewhere buried under snow, and up here the only things that threatened her were things she could see and hear and smell, and she was getting better at those. The vent on day 9 began to weaken. She caught it early because she checked 3 times a day now, and the wool strand test showed a draft that was lower than yesterday. Ice was building on the upper section of the vent passage. The cold coming down differently, heavier. She got the clearing pole. She cleared what she could reach. The draft improved by half, functional. She came back to the fire, ran the test again. The wool strand rose. Day 9 entry on the wall, when partial. Draft reduced, then restored. Temperature held. 2 bundles. Smoke clean. She looked at the 9 entries accumulating on the wall, the temperature columns, the food tracking, the fuel calculations running in the margin updated each evening with actuals against estimates. Her mother's voice somewhere in the back of her memory. A record is not a record until it contains a surprise. If nothing surprises you, you're not learning. The surprises so far, the vent was harder to maintain than she'd expected. The hides lost more moisture to condensation than she'd planned, for she'd rebuilt the sleeping enclosure twice, adjusting the gap between hide and stone until the condensation dropped. The service berry cakes were lasting longer than estimated because soaking them in spring water made them more filling per portion. All surprises, all incorporated, all now recorded. The storm Prentice had warned her about arrived on the morning of day 10. It did not build up gradually. It struck. 1 hour sky overcast wind from the northeast, temperature at 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Next hour wind velocity doubled, temperature at 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The next, snow driven nearly horizontal visibility at the lower passage entrance reduced to nothing. The sound of the falls completely swallowed by wind. She had spent day 9 preparing for it. Drainage channel cleared and widened. Canvas baffle hung 20 inches inside the lower entrance. Rawhide cut in behind it, creating an air pocket. A small willow and bark roof over the entrance that she'd built from the outside in daylight and wouldn't have been able to build in this wind. The long clearing pole beside the vent passage entrance. Tinder divided into 3 containers stored in 3 different locations. Part of the firewood moved deeper into the system. She ran the test at the start of the storm, 6 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Sleeping enclosure holding 49 degrees Fahrenheit, less than 1 full bundle. She wrote it on the wall. Then she settled in to wait. Below in Crest Hollow, the storm was a different experience entirely. The first winds came down the logging road at 3 in the morning and found every weakness in every structure simultaneously. Stovepipe disconnected from the cook shack. Chinking fell from cabin walls. The sound of wood under stress not breaking, not yet but complaining, ran through the buildings like a conversation nobody wanted to hear. Mordecai Ketch's stovepipe glowed red from overfiring. The bunkhouses burned through wood faster than planned, faster than anyone had planned, because planning for a storm like this required understanding a storm like this, and the understanding came after, not before. Families moved to the mess hall to share heat. Water barrels froze. One section of the old weighing shed, the north side where the roof had always been marginal, began to bear the weight of accumulated snow in a way that the structure's remaining integrity was not going to support indefinitely. Rafe Ketch knew about the weighing shed. He had not, in the weeks since the payroll box incident, thought to move what was under the floor. He thought about it now. He put on his coat, got halfway to the door, looked at the wind driving snow sideways past the window, decided it could wait until morning. Prentice Wall sat near the mess hall stove and didn't sleep. His son, Cormac, 9 years old, currently wedged between 2 other children in the makeshift sleeping arrangement, had been asking questions all week about the smoke above the falls, about why his father had gone out east when everyone said the girl was long dead in a ravine somewhere. Prentice had not answered, but Cormac had his mother's persistence and his father's patience, which was a combination that meant he would simply wait and ask again later. And later, in the dark of the mess hall with the storm howling, Cormac leaned against his father's arm and said quietly, "She's still up there, isn't she?" Not a question, an observation. Prentice looked at the stove. "She's managing," he said. "Wendell has a paper," Cormac said. Prentice looked at him. "He keeps touching the inside pocket of his coat, like he's checking it's still there." Cormac tilted his head. "Same way you check your knife when you're going somewhere you're not sure about." Prentice was quiet for a long time. Outside, the storm hit something structural, and the whole mess hall groaned. "Get some sleep," Prentice said. Cormac lay down, but his eyes stayed open a while longer, aimed at the ceiling in the way of a child who is still thinking, even when they've been told to stop. Wendell Foss did have a paper. He had been adding to it for days. Ezra Falk had contributed quietly during 2 long conversations about the numbers that didn't match. The observations Wendell had made at the mess hall tribunal, the timeline of the payroll's disappearance, the testimony not yet given anywhere formal of the 2 teamsters, which Ezra had managed to obtain before they left camp, and which described Rafe paying his debt before dawn with silver coin he had not possessed the previous evening. The paper was folded into quarters and sewn into the lining of his coat. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it. He needed to get it to someone who would know, someone outside Crestallo's gravity, where Mordecai Ketch's word still weighed more than a hired schoolteacher's observations. But to do that, he needed the roads to be passable, which, looking out the mess hall window at a wall of horizontal snow, they were not. He went back to watching the storm and thinking. Inside the mountain, inside the cave, behind the frozen waterfall, Solveig Lund was also watching the storm. Not directly, she couldn't see it from here, but she could feel it in the deep vibration that came through the stone when the wind hit the cliff face above. The mountain registered it differently than the camp below, not as threat, as information. She ran the checks every 3 hours. Vent clear. Lower, entrance canvas baffle holding rawhide, curtain intact snow, building against the outer willow roof, but not yet compromising the structure. Fire burning clean on 2/3 of a bundle. Warmth in the enclosure at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Food on track. She recorded everything. Then she picked up Peavy's journal and read the next section by firelight. The entries from 1879 described the same process she was going through now. The vent discovery, the drainage trench, the sleeping enclosure built of whatever he could find, the gradual learning of the mountain's systems. But then, about halfway through the journal, the tone changed. The entries stopped being about shelter. They started being about the trap lines, his trap lines, the routes he had established over 7 years, the camps he had built, the territories he had negotiated with the Shoshone. Carefully, respectfully, the journal noted, because they had been here longer and knew things about this terrain he was still learning. The routes that had been transferred via paperwork he did not fully understand at the time to alter sketch. And then, in one entry near the back, I went to the county office, asked to see the transfer documents. The clerk showed them to me. The signature is mine, but I did not write it. The date is a day I was on the northern lines, which the journal I kept at the time can verify, but which journal no one has asked to see. I have no money for a lawyer. I have a copy of the document which I made while the clerk was not watching. I don't know yet what to do with it. She turned the page. The copy is in the back cover. She looked at the back cover of the journal. There was a gap between the inner lining and the cover board. Old hide glue dried out, letting the two layers separate slightly. She opened the gap carefully. A piece of paper folded many times to fit, brittle at the creases, but intact. She unfolded it slowly. A hand-copied land transfer document dated November 3rd, 1879, signed with a signature that was trying to look like Prentice Fall's name and not quite succeeding. She sat with this for a long time, not because it changed what she needed to do today. Today, she needed to maintain the fire check, the vent monitor, the food stores, and wait out the storm. But because it meant the wrong that had been done was documented. Somewhere in this mountain, inside a journal left for whoever came next, There was a record of what had actually happened. Her mother's voice. A record is not a record until it contains a surprise. She wasn't surprised, but she was something else. Something she didn't have a word for in either Norwegian or English. The feeling of finding out that you are not the first person to have stood in the place you're standing and not alone in the wrong that put you there, and not despite everything Crestalo had tried to make her feel, not the last word in the story. Just one entry in a longer ledger, one that was still being written. She folded the document carefully and put it back between the journal covers. Then she checked the vent. Then she added a stick to the fire. Then she made the next mark on the wall. Day 10. Storm arrived, and she was still here. Day 11. The storm was still going, but something had changed in it. Not the wind was the same, hammering the cliff face above her in the way it had been doing for 2 days now. Not the temperature that was still sitting at 18 below outside, which she knew because she had checked, because she always checked. What had changed was the sound, or rather a sound inside the sound, coming from the lower passage. Not ice, not falling stone, knocking. She was on her feet before she'd fully decided to be, lamp in hand, pole at her side, moving down the lower passage at the careful pace she'd learned. The ceiling drop at the 14-foot mark, the floor irregularity at 20, toward the lower entrance where the canvas baffle hung between her and whatever was outside. The knocking came again, 3 times, deliberate, not the random impact of wind-driven debris, not an animal. Animals didn't knock in patterns. She reached the baffle. Who's there? A pause, then muffled by canvas and cold and the howling of the storm behind him. Prentice, and a second voice, smaller, thinner with cold. And me. She pulled the baffle aside. Prentice Wall came through first, ducking under the frame she'd built, snow falling from his coat in sheet. Then Cormac, 9 years old, one hand gripping his father's sleeve, his face the specific color of someone who has been cold for a very long time and is only now beginning to understand the danger that implies. His ankle was wrapped in a strip of cloth, awkwardly, the kind of wrapping done by someone who knew it needed to be done but didn't have much to work with. He slipped on the eastern ridge, Prentice said. Not an apology, just information. She switched automatically to the clinical assessment her mother had practiced daily. Eyes tracking good, shivering but coherent also good, color worrying but not yet critical. Sprained, she said. His ankle, probably. How long was he on it? 20 minutes before I found a way to brace it. Come in, she said. Both of you, away from the entrance. She did not put Cormac directly beside the fire. This was the thing people always got wrong about cold. The instinct was heat fast maximum, but warming too quickly sent blood rushing back into extremities that had begun to shut down. The vessels couldn't handle the sudden demand. Her mother had explained this with the patience of someone who had watched people do it wrong enough times to develop an opinion. She placed Cormac in the sleeping enclosure, wrapped him in the driest hide, tucked the warm stones near but not against him. Then she brought water from the spring, not hot. She had no way to make it hot, but held near the fire long enough to take the edge off and gave it to him in small amounts. Prentice watched all of this without speaking, because he was watching the way a person watches when they are learning something. "Yarrow tea helps," she said. "If he can keep it down, he can." She looked at Cormac. "Can you?" Cormac looked up at her from inside the hide enclosure. His color was already better, pink returning to the edges of his face. "Probably," he said, which made Prentice make a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same family. She had the yarrow steeping in the tin cup when Cormac said, "Wendell sent something." She turned. He was reaching into his coat, carefully not jostling the ankle, and producing a folded piece of paper from an inside pocket. She took it, opened it. Wendell Foss's handwriting. Careful and precise, the handwriting of a man who understood that what you wrote down might need to withstand scrutiny later. A list, dated and timed. Rafe Ketch's hand in his coat pocket. The direction of his gaze during the tribunal. The lock with no damage. The spare key unaccounted for. 2 Teamster statements, full names, dates obtained, confirming Rafe had paid a debt before dawn on the night of the theft using silver coin he had not possessed the previous evening. And at the bottom a note in smaller letters. Ezra Falcon reviewed the accounts. The theft amount attributed to Miss Lund does not match the amount missing from the payroll. The discrepancy is consistent with partial removal rather than full theft. He will testify today. We are waiting for passable roads. We are not waiting to have this ready. She read it twice. Then she looked up. Prentice was watching her face. "He's been building it for 2 weeks," Prentice said. "Since the first day." She thought about Wendell Foss, standing at the back of the mess hall, quiet, observing. Her mother had once said that the most dangerous person in any room was the one who watched carefully and said nothing until the moment they chose to say something. She folded the paper. "Is he all right?" she said. "At the camp?" "He's careful," Prentice said. "Careful and not obvious about it. Mordecai doesn't read him as a threat. Because he's the school teacher. Because he's the school teacher." She held the paper for a moment longer. Then she put it with her mother's ledger in the same inside pocket, next to the same heart. Cormac drank the yarrow tea, kept it down. After an hour, his color was fully normal, and he had started looking around the chamber with the particular attention of a child whose brain has decided the crisis is over and it is now time to be interested in things. He looked at the wall, all the charcoal marks, the columns, the temperature readings running down the left side, the fuel entries in the center, the food tracking on the right, the small symbols from the deer hide map that she'd copied down and annotated as she decoded them. He was quiet for a while, studying. "My dad taught me numbers," he said. She glanced at Prentice. He was looking at the wall too, at the entries that started with day 1 and ran through to where she'd left off this morning, all of them in the same precise hand, the same column width, the same careful margin. "He never said where he learned them," Cormac added. Prentice said nothing, but his jaw moved just slightly in the way of a man who is feeling something he hasn't decided to name yet. She picked up the charcoal. "Here, She said to Cormac. This column is temperature. This is the outside reading. This is the inside of the enclosure. What do you notice about them? He looked, tilted his head. The gap, he said, between outside and inside. It gets bigger when it's colder. Why? He thought about it. Because when it's colder outside, the inside stays the same, so the difference gets bigger. Close, the inside drops a little, but the design holds some of the gap. The hides, the stones, the air between the layers. She drew a quick diagram beside the numbers. 2 lines representing hide walls, a gap between. What does that gap do? He leaned forward to look, forgetting his ankle, wincing when he put weight on it, then settling back carefully. Traps something? Air, still air. It doesn't move, so it doesn't carry heat away. She paused. My father taught me that. Cormac looked at the wall again, at all the numbers, all the careful marks. Did he teach you all of this? Some of it. My mother taught me other parts. And whoever built this place originally, she gestured at the older marks on the wall, the Shoshone, stake holes, the drainage trench. They taught me the rest. I just had to learn how to read it. Prentice moved then. He stood up from where he'd been sitting against the wall and walked to the far end of the chamber, to the shelf where the journal sat. He picked it up, didn't open it, just held it. I left it in 81, he said. When I came back up to check the cache, I thought. He stopped. I thought if I left it, whoever found it would at least know they weren't the first. She looked at him. It helped, she said. He set the journal down carefully, back exactly where it had been. The document in the back, he said. I read it. What do you think? She was quiet for a moment. I think it's been up here for 10 years, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. She paused. I think Wendell Foss is the right person to have that conversation with. Prentice nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has spent 10 years carrying something and can feel distantly the possibility of setting it down. Knowledge doesn't disappear when the person who holds it is silent. That was what she was understanding in this chamber with these 2 people who had found their way to her through a storm. Prentice Ball had been silenced by a document he couldn't afford to contest and had carried what he knew in his body for 10 years in the way he walked the trap lines that had been taken from him, in the way he had left supplies in this cave, in the way he had taught his son numbers without explaining where they came from. Her mother had taught midwifery to 3 women in the valley before the crossing, had copied her herb records twice and given 1 copy away because she understood that knowledge given away was not knowledge lost. The Shoshone who had built this shelter in the first place had designed it with such precision. The drainage, the vent, the elevated storage, that someone could come here a generation later and find the logic still intact, still legible, still working. It found another pair of hands, and those hands found more. She picked up the charcoal, turned to a fresh section of wall, and began writing down everything she knew about the vent system. Not for herself, she already knew it, for whoever came next. The storm broke on day 13, not all at once. It tapered. The horizontal snow became vertical. Snow became flurries, became still cold air with a sky that was starting to show its structure again through the overcast. Prentice and Cormac had been in the chamber for 3 days. The ankle had come down enough that Cormac could put weight on it carefully. Prentice had spent the days helping with the maintenance tasks, wood hauling vent, clearing the small endless work of keeping a system functional. He did it without commentary, just as the work it was. On the morning of the 13th day, Solveig stood at the lower passage entrance and breathed outside air for the first time since the storm hit. Cold, clear, the kind of air that had been cleaned by days of violence and was now completely itself. The valley below was white, solid white in every direction, broken only by the dark lines of the trees and the barely visible thread of smoke rising from Crestallow's chimneys. Multiple threads. They were burning everything they had. She looked at it for a long time, then came back inside. "Time to go down," she said. Prentice went first. He had somewhere to be before the rest of them came down. Something to do at that southern bridge. She didn't ask him to explain. He knew the mountain. He knew what needed doing. That was enough. She and Cormac came down 2 hours later, following the eastern ridge line in the tracks Prentice had already made. Cormac's ankle held. He moved carefully, deliberately, without complaint. Halfway down, he said, "She's going to be okay, isn't she? Solveig." She was 3 steps ahead of him. She paused. "Who are you talking to?" "Myself," he said. "I do that." She looked at him. He looked back at her with his father's eyes, which had apparently been watching everything this entire time. "Yes," she said, and kept walking. The weighing shed's north wall was the first thing she saw when they came into the valley. Half of it was down. The roof section, the problematic section, the one Solveig had noted, was marginal. 3 months ago, in her supply notes, had given way under the accumulated snow weight, and the collapse had taken part of the wall with it. Men were standing around it, looking at the damage, looking at each other. Ezra Falk was on his knees inside what remained of the structure. He was looking at something in the floor. He had found the floorboard by accident. The collapse had shifted a roof beam, which had torqued a floor joist, which had lifted one end of a floorboard that had previously sat flush. He'd stepped on the raised edge while assessing the structural damage and felt it give differently than the boards around it. He pried it up, found the walnut box, brass lock intact, one corner with old pry marks. The weight of it immediately familiar. He had carried it himself after all, and you remembered weights like that. He set it on the floor in front of him and did not open it immediately. He just looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up. Wendell Foss was standing in the gap where the wall had been. "She didn't take it," Ezra said. "No," Wendell said. "She didn't." They carried the box to the mess hall. They set it on the table, the same table where Solveig's contract had been torn in half, where her sewing pouch had been laid out as evidence, where Mordecai Ketch had delivered his judgment with the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his own accounting. Ezra opened it. Coins, payroll script, most of the contents intact. And beside the box, still in the floor of the weighing shed, where the collapse had revealed them a spare office key. A scrap of canvas caught on a nail, the distinctive washed-out brown of Rafe Ketch's winter coat. 3 pieces of paper folded together discovered beneath a separate loose board that the same joist had disturbed. Gambling debts, signed, Rafe Ketch's name on each one, the amounts added together matching almost precisely the amount missing from the box. The missing amount that had been attributed to Solveig Lund. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Wendell reached into the lining of his coat, produced his folded paper, set it on the table beside the box. "I've been building this since the tribunal," he said. "I'll need someone to countersign the Teamster statements as witness." Ezra looked at the paper. "Read it." "I'll countersign," he said. Mordecai Ketch stood at the edge of the room. He had come in with everyone else, because when a crowd moves toward something in a camp this size, you either move with it or you announce yourself as something to be suspicious of. He was looking at the box, at the death notes, at the scrap of canvas from his son's coat. He tried. Perhaps she and Rafe worked together. "The Teamsters were paid before dawn," Ezra said, not looking up from Wendell's paper. "In silver coin that matches this box's inventory. Rafe paid them before the theft was even reported." A silence. "The spare key hasn't been returned to his father's desk," Wendell added. "That was the key used. The lock shows no forced entry." Another silence. The room was full of people who had been in the mess hall 3 weeks ago, who had stood and watched, who had made their separate calculations about what it cost to speak, and decided the cost was too high. Some of them were looking at Mordecai now with a different arithmetic in their eyes. Rafe Ketch was saddling his horse when Prentice Wall stepped into the doorway of the stable. He had come back from the southern bridge, apparently doing nothing of note, just standing there in the cold, looking at the road south. But the road south was the only road, and Prentice was standing in the stable doorway now, and Rafe's horse was saddled, but Rafe was not yet on it. "Move," Rafe said. Prentice didn't move. He wasn't large. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing there in the doorway with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades learning exactly how much energy each action requires and never spending more than necessary. Rafe looked at him. Prentice looked back. The road behind Prentice was the only road south. The mountains in every other direction were for the moment impassable, and Sheriff Owain Drexler, who had been alerted via a rider sent out the moment the passes opened this morning, was somewhere on that same road coming north. Rafe knew this. He could tell from Prentice's face that Prentice knew he knew. They stood there in the stable doorway in the cold. 10 years. 10 years of Prentice knowing what had been done to him and having nothing to prove it. 10 years of working Crestallo's terrain as Crestallo terrain because there was nothing else to do. 10 years of carrying the journal up to the cache and checking it and coming back down and saying nothing because saying nothing was what you did when certainty had no evidence. He didn't say any of that now. He just stood in the doorway, and Rafe Ketch, who was good at calculations, calculated, and did not get on the horse. Sheriff Owain Drexler arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He was a direct man. He looked at the evidence in the order it was presented to him. He asked questions and waited for complete answers before asking the next one. When he was done reviewing what was on the table, he looked up at Mordecai Ketch. "Where is your son?" Mordecai said he didn't know, which was technically true because Rafe was currently in the stable, which was 40 yards from the mess hall, and nobody had updated his father on that specific detail yet. The sheriff found him 15 minutes later in Rafe's saddlebag when the sheriff asked him to turn it out 2 more Silver Run payroll vouchers, not the ones from the box. Earlier, ones from a previous transit, which created a second and third data point in a pattern that was becoming very clear. Rafe was arrested. He did not fight it. He looked in the moment the sheriff took him by the arm like a man who has been calculating the odds for a long time and has just realized that the thing he thought was working in his favor had never been working in his favor at all, that the storm hadn't finished what he started, that the evidence was sitting in a collapsed shed, and all the snow in the world hadn't been enough to keep the roof from coming down eventually. He didn't say anything. Neither did anyone else. Solveig arrived at the camp gate just as the sheriff was walking Rafe to the holding room. She had come down from the mountain with Cormac following Prentice's tracks on the eastern ridge, and she had arrived in the camp the way she had left it, on foot, alone, without fanfare, except that this time she was not leaving, and the gate was standing open. She walked through it. People stopped, looked. She looked back at each face that met hers, briefly and directly in the way her mother had taught her to look at patients, seeing them, not performing the seeing. She went to the mess hall. The walnut box was on the table, open. Ezra Falk was there. Wendell Foss was there. Several of the workers. And Mordecai Ketch was there at the edge of the room. The way a man is still when the thing he built his certainty on has stopped supporting weight. He looked at her. She looked at him. She had thought during the nights in the cave about what this moment would be like, what she would feel, whether she would be angry, whether she would want to say things that were accurate but expensive to say in front of witnesses. What she actually felt standing in the doorway of the mess hall looking at Mordecai Ketch was something quieter than anger, something closer to clarity. She walked to the table, looked at the box, at the death notes, at Wendell's paper lying open beside them. Mordecai said from the edge of the room, "I acted on the evidence available at the time." She looked up, not at him exactly, at the space just past him where the words were still hanging in the air. "You refused 3 things," she said. Her voice was the same voice she'd used to keep the books. Level, clear, the voice for communicating information that needed to be received accurately. The lock, the footprints, the spare key. He opened his mouth. She went back to looking at the box. She was done with that sentence. She had said what needed saying. She wasn't going to repeat it or expand it or perform it. It was true, and she'd said it, and that was enough. The room was very quiet. Mordecai Ketch stood in it. He had built Crestallo on exactly this kind of quiet, on rooms full of people who had calculated what it cost to speak and kept their mouths shut. He knew this quiet better than anyone. He just had never been on this side of it before. After a long moment, he turned toward the door, walked out through the mess hall, through the yard, to the passage that led to the cave, because Wendell had told him where she'd been, because the sheriff had said he'd want to speak to the site, and he went through the lower entrance and down the passage, ducking where the ceiling dropped, stepping carefully where the floor was uneven, into the chamber. He stood in it, looked at the walls, the columns, the charcoal marks running from day 1 through day 13, in a hand he recognized because it was the same hand that had kept his books for 2 years. The sleeping enclosure built from hides and willow branches with a precision that someone who understood insulation would immediately recognize. The elevated storage, the drainage trench, the vent passage with the clearing pole beside it. He stood in this chamber for a long time, and then he turned toward the exit. At the entrance to the lower passage, a rawhide curtain hung. The baffle she'd made from material she'd found in this cave, lashed to a frame she'd built herself, installed to create an air pocket that kept the cold from pushing directly into the living space. He had to duck to go under it. He had to bow his head to leave the place she'd built. He did it, and came out the other side into the daylight and the cold. And Solveig Lund was not there to watch him go, because she was back in the mess hall with Ezra Falk and Wendell Foss, looking at the numbers in the payroll account and helping Ezra reconcile what was actually there against what had been attributed to whom. She was keeping books, her books now, later, after the sheriff had left with Rafe, after the workers had returned to their tasks with the particular subdued energy of people who have witnessed something they need time to process. After Ezra Falk had confirmed that the debt attributed to Solveig Lund carried no legal weight without the contract that had generated it, and the contract had been torn in half and was somewhere at the bottom of a snowdrift. After all of that, she was alone in the mess hall. She sat at the long table, not the head, not Mordecai's end, the middle, where the workers sat. She had the piece of paper Wendell had sent with Cormac in her hand. She was reading it again, not because she needed to, but because there was something she wanted to sit with a little longer. We are waiting for passable roads. We are not waiting to have this ready. He had started the day she was expelled. She had started the day she arrived at the cave. Two people in two different places, keeping records in parallel, both working toward the same truth, neither knowing the other was doing it. Her mother again, somewhere a record, is not a record until it contains a surprise. She was surprised, not that she'd been cleared. She had always known she was innocent. What surprised her was that she had not been alone. She had thought she was alone. She had gone up that mountain and built her survival in a cave and kept her records on a stone wall and understood herself to be, in the most fundamental sense, the only person working on her problem. And she had not been. Prentice Wall, with his journal and his silence and his spare supplies and his years of learning the mountains that had been taken from him, Wendell Foss in the back of the mess hall watching Rafe's hands. Rowena Briggs holding the coat. Ezra Falk with his inconvenient arithmetic. Even PV, the original PV, the 1879 version, who had built a shelter so well that it was still functional a decade later for someone he had never met and had no way of knowing would need it. None of them had known they were part of the same thing. And yet, Rowena Briggs came in the evening. She came in without knocking. You didn't knock on the mess hall. It was a communal space and set something on the table beside Solveig's paper. The coat. Canvas, wool lining, heavy in the way of things built to last rather than built to be admired. Rowena sat down on the bench across from her and put her hands flat on the table. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Rowena said, "I knew." Solveig looked up. "I didn't know for certain," Rowena said. "But I watched Rafe that morning. After the box went missing, he was moving the way men move when they're trying to look like they're not moving for a reason." She paused. "I've been watching men try to do that for 40 years. Why didn't you say something?" Rowena looked at her hands. "Half my winter ration," she said, which was not an excuse, just a fact. The specific fact of what it cost to be a woman in Crestalo in 1889 alone with children in winter. Solveig looked at the coat. "I'm sorry," Rowena said. "That I didn't." A long silence. "Half a winter ration," Solveig said finally, "is a lot to ask someone to risk." Rowena looked up. Her eyes were very direct. "Not enough," she said, "but a lot." They sat with that. Then Solveig picked up the coat and stood. She didn't put it on. She folded it over her arm, carried it to the door, found a wooden peg on the wall beside the entry, the kind that had always been there, functional and unremarkable, and hung the coat on it. She stood back, looked at it. "That stays there," she said. Rowena looked at it too. "Yes," she said. She did not go back to Crest Hollow. That was decided within a day of her return, and it was not a painful decision. It was simply accurate. Creatalo was Mordecai Ketch's operation, even diminished, and it was diminished in ways that would take time to fully manifest. As workers saw the debt ledgers and asked questions and began doing their own arithmetic, it was still his. She had never wanted it. What she wanted was the high ground, not metaphorically, literally. She wanted the ridge above Hollow-Mist, the timber rights on the eastern slope, which Wendell had looked up in the county records and found to be unassigned. The water rights to the spring in the cave. She filed for them herself in the county office in January with Ezra Falk as witness. The clerk looked at her filing with the expression of a man who was trying to find a polite way to ask why. "Because I know this land," she said, "and I'll use it well." She got the rights. The land transfer document from the back of PV's journal went to Wendell Foss. He combined it with his own evidence and Ezra Falk's accounting discrepancies and a statement from two Shoshone men, friends of the original builders of the cave, who had known Prentice Wall's work on those lines for years and remembered when they changed hands, and he submitted the entire package to the county magistrate. It took 4 months. Legal matters in Idaho Territory in 1889 took 4 months when they went well. Prentice Fall got the eastern trap lines back, not all of them, but the core routes, the ones he'd established, the camps he'd built, the territories he'd developed. Enough, he said nothing dramatic when the ruling came through. He told Cormac over dinner. Cormac said, "Now we can name them what they were." And Prentice looked at his son for a long moment with something in his face that Solveig, when she heard about it later, thought she understood. The particular feeling of a weight you have been carrying so long, it stopped feeling like weight. And then you put it down, and you feel not light, not triumphant, just the size you were before someone made you smaller. Spring came slowly to Sawtooth Valley. The way spring always came at that elevation, tentative, then committed, then all at once. She built her cabin on the high ground above the falls. Small, functional, built to work with the slope rather than against it, the way the original builders of the cave had designed their drainage. Log walls, tight enough that she wasn't fighting the cold, just managing it. The cave stayed part of her life. Winter storage, storm shelter, the place she went when she needed to think without distraction. She added to the walls every visit. Temperature comparison between the cave and the new cabin. Notes on the spring's behavior across seasons. Observation about the snowshoe hare population, the way the vent behaved differently in dry coal versus wet coal. She was keeping a journal now. She thought about calling it PV's Journal Volume 2. She decided against it. It was hers. Wendell Foss started a school in the valley the following autumn. Not a camp school, a real one, with a building and desks and children who came from 3 different settlements, because there was nowhere else for them to go. Solveig came twice a month. She sat with the older children in the back, the ones who had come to school after years of working, who found reading slower going than the young ones, and sometimes felt embarrassed by that. She taught them what she knew. Keep tinder in more than one place. Never put bedding directly against a cold wall. Test a draft before you build a fire. Watch the wind on the snow. The direction of the drifts tells you the direction of the prevailing pattern, and you can use that when you're choosing where to build. Keeping heat matters more than making heat. The children wrote these things in their notebooks. Some of them understood right then. Some of them would understand years later when they were cold somewhere and the knowledge surfaced from wherever learned things go when you're not using them. And some of them would teach it to someone else. One afternoon, after the other children had gone, Cormac Wall stayed behind. The chart on the cave wall, he said, Day 7, outside -4, bed 52. Yes. One bundle, smoke clean, hides dry. Yes. He thought about it. Those numbers didn't happen by accident, he said. No, you made them happen. I kept adjusting until they worked. He nodded slowly, with his father's nod, the one that meant he was filing something in a place where it wouldn't get lost. My dad said you'd have been fine even without Wendell's paper. She thought about that. I would have been alive, she said. That's not the same thing as fine. Cormac looked at her. He said that too, he said. that there's a difference. The marks on the cave wall stayed. She cleaned around them in spring when she did her annual maintenance on the cache. The chamber stayed dry enough the same way it had stayed dry through the winter that had tested it most severely. Day 1 through day 13. Temperature, fuel, food. The small note at the end of each entry that recorded not what she felt but what she had done. Below the 13 days of storm records, her handwriting continued. New entries, seasonal observations, the vent's behavior in March versus November, the spring's flow rate across the year, and beside her entries in the same deliberate hand the older notes from P. 1879. Two handwritings on the same wall, one record. When Wendell came to copy the Deerhide map carefully, with notes marking which symbols appeared to be original Shoshone and which appeared to be later additions, he stood for a long time looking at the wall before he started. "This is a document," he said. "Yes, it should have a title." She thought about that. "It has one," she said. She picked up the charcoal and wrote at the top of the temperature column above day 1 what it cost, what it held, what it kept. Wendell looked at it. "Yes," he said. "That." Rowena Briggs's coat stayed on the peg by the mess hall door. For a long time nobody moved it, because nobody was sure they had the authority to move it. Then the question of authority became irrelevant, because it had been there long enough to become fixed, not in anyone's mind exactly, but in the architecture of the place. It was part of the mess hall now. In winter, it kept collecting a little snow when the door was left open, and someone without discussion always brushed it off. There is knowledge you are given, and there is knowledge you are not given, because the person who had it was silenced or dismissed, or walked out a gate with nothing but a blanket and half a loaf of barley bread. Solveig Lund knew both kinds. She had been given her mother's records, her father's timber sense, the language of numbers that told the truth even when people didn't. She had been given P.V.'s journal and the maps of people who had understood this mountain long before any of them arrived. And she had been not given things too, had walked out of a camp with 2 years of careful work attributed to someone else's crime, had stood in a room full of people who calculated the cost of speaking and stayed silent. Both kinds of knowledge were real. Both were hers now. And on the wall of the cave behind Hollow Falls, in charcoal marks that had survived 13 days of blizzard, and one winter and another, and the slow turning of years, the numbers she had written when she had nothing else. Day 7, outside -4, bed 52, one bundle, smoke clean, hides dry. She had not written what she felt, she had written what she did, and what she did turned out to be enough. More than enough. What about you? You have been carrying knowledge someone gave you, your mother, your grandmother, the woman who raised you, the one who never got credit for what she knew, something you use every week, maybe every day, that you never stop to call wisdom. What is it? Tell me in the comments below, because I have a feeling there are more Solveig Lunds out there than anyone has ever counted. And next time, I want to tell you about another woman who was told for most of her life that what she knew didn't count. She proved them wrong at 53. That story is coming.